Thanks to everybody for attending. Uh, what I'm going to show you today is a very obscure railroad. I'm just curious if you could raise your hand if you've heard of the Can Railroad. Good, good. The Can has been gone 107 years as of this year. So when I decided to write this book, I had the cooperation of the Quasqueton Area Historical Society and also one of their staff, Deb Crawford, was a researcher, and she done an absolute wonderful job of researching electronic archives of newspapers from around the area. And that's what we put together in this book. And as you can imagine, a railroad that's been gone this long, trying to find photos for the book was a real chore. But we did manage to find some real gems. So with that said, the Chicago Anamosa Northern started in Anamosa and went approximately 16 miles originally to Coggan. That all occurred in 1904, 1905. And then in 1911, the railroad was extended from Coggan another approximately 16 miles to Quasqueton. And it rolled into Quasqueton in 1912, and it lasted another 3 years before it went belly up. So what I want to do is kind of show you the story of what transpired here. You're looking at a logo that we found on tickets and internal to the company. This is another logo that was used on company papers. And we found several pieces where this logo was used. And then you'll notice that from the previous logo, we have railway. In this one, we have railroad for whatever reasons. Here's the full route of the Can, the Chicago Anamosa Northern. And you'll notice there's several towns along here that actually were born on the railroad and died on the railroad. And I'll talk about those as we get going here. But the biggest, most expensive segment of the railroad was actually from Anamosa to Fremont because of a stone. It was almost like a quarry, and they spent huge amount of money just getting the rails through this part of the country. This is the gentleman from Dubuque that actually financed the railroad. His name is Peter Keene. A lot of people call it Keeney. I prefer to call it Keene. This is his office in Dubuque. And he was the money behind the railroad, even though he was not actively involved in operating the railroad. He had a brother, that Henry, that was involved in the railroad, and he sweet talked his older brother into loaning the money to launch the railroad. Now, the start of the railroad was in Anamosa. This is the Chicago Northwestern engine house. And since the Can was just getting started, the Chicago Northwestern had a couple extra stalls, and so the can used the Chicago Northwestern engine house for a lot of their maintenance. And for those of you that are familiar with railroads in eastern Iowa, the Chicago Northwestern actually started in Clinton and ended in Anamosa. Hence, they needed an engine house for their locomotives. This is a can locomotive. You see the logo on the locomotive itself. This is the turntable that accompanies that engine house. And this was one of the rare photos that we were able to get of a locomotive that actually had the can logo on the railroad. Just a matter of interest, the gentleman's with his leaning out the window, the engineer, that's Charles Corwin, and the guy standing in the doorway is his son, Charlie Corwin. This is the original Anamosa Union Depot that was shared by the Milwaukee Road on the right side and the Chicago Northwestern on the left side. The can actually used this depot for a couple of years before it was torn down and a new Union Depot was built. But the can actually came along and used the platform and the ticket agency in the depot itself. This is the new Union Depot in Anamosa, and you're looking at the Milwaukee Road side. This is the CNW side of the depot, and the can actually leased space from the Milwaukee after this structure was built. I want to draw your attention to this structure right here. This is the original Milwaukee Road freight depot, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Here's the Milwaukee Road freight depot, a 1960 photo. Just keep that in mind as we go through here. As the can headed out of Anamosa, the first thing they came to was this mill called Anderson's Mill. And you can see the dam on the left. This was before the railroad arrived. This is after the railroad arrived. This is a 1,100-foot timber trestle. And I'll tell you that it didn't last very long because the Buffalo Creek right here, when the ice went out in the spring, it did not like this trestle. Here's another view of that 1,100-foot trestle. Couple ladies standing on it. They're not trespassing. They're just looking things over. Here's a winter scene of the same trestle. This one here is a very rare photo that I had kind of beg off of a lady that I know that she had in her private collection. Now, this map here, I wanted to show you. Anderson's Mill is approximately right here. And the trestle actually started about right here and went along this length here for 1,100 feet. Now, the other thing I want to draw your attention to is this line up here. That's the CNW. it's a branch or it's a siding that actually goes to this quarry. But you'll see that the CNW was pretty smart. They stayed out of the water with their rails. And eventually the can had to use this line after they took their trestle out. I talked about the rock cut at Fremont. This is an early photo where they're blasting their way through. That's not a cross at the end down there. That's actually a marker for the surveyors and the dynamite crew. Keep them going in the right direction. And you also notice there's a cart up there at the end of where the blasting ended. Most of this was all done by hand. They blasted out, and then they'd pick up the rocks and throw them in these dump bottom wagons and take them to where they needed to fill. Here's a couple completed photos of the cut. I'm thinking that we're looking at going in the cut one way and coming back out the other. I have no proof of that, but it looks fairly familiar. After Fremont, the first town you come to is a place called Jackson. A lot of people called it Jackson Station. This is the plat for Jackson Station. And this was another town that was born and died on the can. Here's the store at Jackson Station with the proprietor out front, Dan Meredith. And this is the only photo I've ever seen of the building that actually had a railroad car attached to the photo. And if you look very closely to this, this appears to be a double-decker stock car. Also at this location, the can developed a sand pit, and they used a lot of this commercially for different areas where sand was needed, especially through lumber yards and what have you. You can see in this case, they have an Illinois Central car that they are loading. But if you look, this is in the book, you'll see that this one actually says Chicago, Anamosa, and Northern. About 1.5 miles further from Jackson Station is another location called Anderson. And this photo I actually got after the book was published, because getting into this property, it's all private property, and you could probably get yourself shot if you were on this property. But this is, it's hard to tell, but this is, we're looking at a quarry here all around the different areas here. This is all rock behind the trees. And further out from where the quarry was, the owner of this property still mows the right of way, which I thought was kind of neat. Next town further up the line is Prairieburg. And Prairieburg had been established before the railroad arrived. They hadn't yet been incorporated, but they were in the process of becoming a city. And you're probably wondering that at the end of that spur that heads to the north up there, that's where they put the depot. And you're probably wondering, well, why would you put a depot up here when you could put it down here on the main line? Well, when the town helped pay for the railroad, the contract read that they had to be within 100 yards of the main well in the town. And if they would have put it down on the main line, they would not have met the conditions of their contract. So hence, we have a depot. And this is actually on a little bit of a hill. You can see the main line. Let me get this. This is the main line down here. There's actually a siding that you can't see in here that comes up by the depot. And then the next town from Prairieburg was the end of the line until 1910. And this is the Coggin Depot and the water tank, and it's set right beside Buffalo Creek. They actually pump the water right out of the creek. If you could see beyond the main line here, towards the bottom of the photo, that rail dead ends at the Illinois Central. They had not yet put the diamond in. The rail to the left actually goes up and joins the Illinois Central so they can interchange cars. And as near as we can tell, there is a Y up there that a portion of the Y actually used the Illinois Central main line. This is a real rare photo. I happened to find this in the archives of the Quasqueton Area Historical Society. And I did some research on it and found that this is a locomotive mounted plow on a 440, and the locomotive behind it is actually a borrowed Milwaukee Road locomotive. Now I want to draw your attention there's a couple people standing up here. I found that real interesting to see where they're going to go after this plow went through the area. This is just between Jackson and Anderson. Here's a 1906 timetable. Shows the stops that they recognize between Anamosa and Coggin. And about this time, the railroad also actually leased some property at various areas along the line for people to actually go and have a picnic. And they had excursions out to these areas regularly in the summertime. And I even read one place where they had a dance floor, and the only way you got there is by the rail. Now this is a real interesting photo. This hasn't got anything to do with the can. There's this gentleman and this gentleman actually worked for the Can Railroad and built the railroad between Anamosa and Coggin. They left the Can, started their own endeavor, and tried to build a railroad from the west bank of the Quasqueton, and they were trying to get to Waterloo. I just want you to keep this photo in mind here because we're going to talk about a couple things later on. But the railroad they were building was the Iowa and Northwestern. They never laid a stick of track or laid one tie, but they did complete right away. Here's 1910 timetable. And one thing I forgot to mention up here, if you'll notice, earlier, Henry Keene, that's Peter Keene's brother. Peter held the purse strings to the railroad. And you also notice there's a younger brother right here, Paul Keene. He was the treasurer and purchasing agent for the railroad. He made his home in Anamosa for several years. Henry was in Dubuque with his brother, Peter. I want to draw your attention. We got a place here called Neely. That's one of the spots that the railroad leased so they could have a picnic area. This gentleman's name is Lewis E. Myers. He's from Chicago. And when the Keenes wanted to build the railroad from Coggin to Quasky, they actually talked this guy into financing and building the railroad. Some of you may recognize the L.E. Myers name. They're a big electrical contractor firm here in the United States today. This particular gentleman founded that company. Here's the 1911 timetable. And you'll see down at the bottom, they have made it to Robinson, not quite to Keeney yet. And of course, not to Quasky. But I want to draw your attention to, they had grandiose plans to go beyond Quasky to Independence and also to Waterloo. And there was a sliver of ground in here where the right-of-way was completed. L.E. Myers, when he came on the scene, he was used to building railroads. And instead of doing anything with horse and wagon, which were still used, but he came with his equipment and was highly mechanized. Here you see a steam tractor helping prepare the right-of-way. This is north of Coggin. And also I want to draw your attention, this is one of those slips that they use. Some of you old farmers probably recognize that. Maybe a little more modern than what this one is, but that was used to move dirt. Here's a cut, not too far out of Robinson. And notice all the rocks up on the banks. Guess how they got up there? This is a machine. It was like a big plow that actually loosened the dirt. And you'll see a conveyor belt right here. And this gentleman with a dump bottom wagon would pull up and they would load his wagon and away he'd go to wherever they needed to fill. Here's the heaviest piece of machinery that L.A. Myers brought to the scene. This is a 70-ton Vulcan steam shovel, and it was used to make cuts, and in this case, they're actually widening a cut. This gentleman's name right here is Mr. Buchanan. He worked for the construction company, and he was very talented in a lot of different things, and actually ended up marrying a woman and living in Quaski, and eventually became a mayor. Here's the crew. This is what they call the ground crew that helped direct where the bucket would go. And as near as I can tell, that bucket was probably, I want to guess, between 2.5 and 3 yards. Now here's another crew. This 70-ton machine is self-propelled, but it has to be on its own set of rails. These guys here, they're trying to stay ahead of it by taking ties from in front of the machine and moving them to the back of the machine, or vice versa, whichever way they're going. And then they'd lay temporary rails, and the machine, which was chain driven, would be able to move to the next location of where they wanted to take out the dirt. Here's what they did with the dirt. These are little jennies. You could probably put maybe 2 bucketfuls, maybe a little bit more in each one of these. And you can tell they look very spindly. They're actually balanced, gravity balanced, and 2 men can actually dump one of these. They have chains on both sides, and all you got to do is put a little weight on the side and it will tip either left or right. And here's the little train. L.A. Myers actually had 2 trains or 2 locomotives, 6 to 8 cars each to remove the overburden. And if you look at the rail, don't that look safe? Now here's a method that was used on a lot of railroads. If they're actually taking the overburden to an area where they need fill. Look at this trestle. Whoops. What they do is they'll back this thing out on this spindly trestle. They'll dump the dirt, and it will go down through the ties, down through the bents, and eventually this will become solid ground. And I actually found a note to where they actually had a partial collapse of one of their trestles. So a lot of labor involved yet. Here's a rail train that is actually unloading the final rail. They used temporary rail. You can see some of it under the wheels, but they're actually unloading the rail that will be used on the line, and it's all heavy duty 65-pound. I forgot to mention, from Anamosa to Coggin, it was heavy duty 60 pounds. Here's one of L.A. Meyer's good photo of his locomotives. He actually had two of these, and from looking at them, it looks like he really took good care of these. And the cars, the flat cars, are also his as well. Next town up the line from Coggin was Robinson. And Robinson is another town that was born and died on the railroad. Although if you go there today, which you can do, there is a brick building that was a bank at one time that remains. This is Main Street, Robinson, with the elevator. Lumber yard. Here's the depot at Robinson. And as near as I can tell, this is a northbound train. And they're actually going to the celebration in Quasqueton after the first train arrived. So this is an excursion train to help Quasqueton do the celebration. Next town after Robinson is a little town that was called Keene, or Keene, however you want to pronounce it. And it wasn't named by the brothers. The name came about by the people that lived in the area. They wanted to recognize the family by naming the town Keene. I tried finding a plat of this town and I could not find anything, but we did find this hand drawn map, and it actually came from a person that lived in Keene at one time.
I went to church till I was a teenager in the Keene church. And you could walk out the back of the church and see the foundation still in the lumber yard and the elevator.
There's
there on the Teleline house, there was a big cut. But that couldn't filled in by.
Is that the house that's standing?
No.
There's one house in Keene that's standing, and I haven't figured out where it was in relationship to this. Here's the depot at Keene, and if you look closely, you can see the rail arriving right beyond the mules. Nice looking depot. 2-story, probably for the depot agent to live above.
Just east of this location, there's a large hill. And they came up this hill and a couple of big sharp ass curves to get to this point. It was really cool.
Yep. Here, rail has arrived. You see the date, May 30th, 1912. And here's the rail train. Load of brand new rails. And haven't quite figured out what this little dolly's for. I have sneaking suspicion it's for running the rail out so they can lay it back on the ties. After Keene, approximately 4.5 to 5 miles was Quasqueton. And a lot of construction still going on when this photo was taken. I don't have a photo of it, but there was a water tank, and I got a sneaking suspicion that's where this photo was taken. The building on the left in the foreground is the temporary depot for Quasqueton. They were supposed to have gotten a brick depot. That was in the plans. The lumber yard, or the stockyards being built. You can see the scales that are already installed. Couple locomotives, construction locomotives. And I don't quite understand it, but they actually opened a pit right in Quasqueton to ballast the railroad from there to Coggin. And that's what you see right here is they're digging a pit, and you can see the little ore jennies off the left side there, using those to ballast the railroad. Arrival of two locomotives. It's kind of a rare photo that we happened to get from an individual. And as near as I can tell, for anybody from Quasqueton, I think where the sewage lagoon is today, this is actually the start of the sewage lagoons. Engine house and turntable at the end of the line. I'd like to see how they got this thing in there. Here's the first construction train that arrived in Quasqueton, Labor Day, 1912. The whole town turned out. Even the Quasqueton Coronet Band turned out. But this is the construction train. It's just interesting to look at some of the people in these old photos and thinking that we finally got a railroad. This dapper gentleman right here. This is actually the first non-construction locomotive and train that got into Quasqueton. And this is on September 5th of 1912. Kind of a rare boxcar there, if you ask me. Mississippi Central. And the combines that you see here, the can actually, before they folded, had 3 of these. The other interesting thing about these construction trains with the big headlight for backing up, I've never seen one mounted quite like that. Well, if you have a railroad coming to your town, you got to have a celebration. And this postcard went out to everybody in the area, inviting them to come to the celebration. And as it turned out, the first day wasn't too bad. Second day, gully washer. And they actually delayed it a few days, and they had another go at it, and with the same results. Here's a newspaper article I wanted to draw your attention to about changes that took place in the management of the can. Lewis Myers discovered that the can had some very unorthodox accounting practices. One of them was not paying offline railroads for the shipments into Pulaski or anywhere on the can. And for that time, it came to about $12,000 of fees that the can had not paid to participating railroads. As a result, one thing I forgot to tell you is when Myers decided to construct the railroad, one of his requirements was that he become vice president of the can. So that was a formality. So when this happened, he was vice president, but he had actually footed the money to build the entire railroad from Coggin to Pulaski. Came right out of his pocket. He went in, he actually fired Henry, who was running the railroad, also fired Peter. He was the treasurer of the railroad. And he made Peter the vice president. Peter was in Dubuque running the financial institution because Lewis wanted to have somebody there with the purse strings. And so all this happened in the flash of an eye. Henry was gone. And so what happened was that L.E. Myers elevated himself to as the president of the railroad. So a lot of changes took place right after the railroad arrived in Pulaski. Then guess what happened? Same year, December 6th, the guy that held the purse strings in Dubuque died. As near as I can tell, it was like a stroke. And since he died, the company had to take a look at how they were going to survive. And as a result, there was a run on the company of they had a savings and loan, and they couldn't meet the debts. And so that also affected the can railroad. So here is the beginning of the financial problems that the can was looking at with the death of Peter Keene. Here's the December 22nd, 1912, or actually 26th, 1912 timetable. You can see that there's still life, they think, from Anamosa to Pulaski to Independence into Waterloo. Now, when all this happened, L.E. Myers, I didn't find anything in writing, but I have a suspicion that he would very much like to sell the railroad. And because his company was formed to construct railroads, not to operate them. Well, coincidentally, we found this pass from the Chicago, Anamosa, and Northern to an F. McDonald that happened to be the superintendent of purchasing stores for the Waterloo, Cedar Falls, and Northern. This could have been an investigation trip. I have no proof of that, but this could have been the start of the WCF&N having interest in the Can Railroad. It was even written about in several newspapers where there was a Lewis Cass, who was the oldest brother of, I believe, 3 or 4 Cass brothers that actually owned the WCF&N. And there was a lot of activity that was at least looked at to see if anything was possible with the Can Railroad. Here's the very last timetable that was published in December 1915. More WCF&N. We contemplate buying the Can Railroad. One of the things that happened at this time frame is that there was a large storm that created 5 to 6 inches of rain in the Buffalo Creek area. And it actually washed out a lot of rail between Kewaskum and Coggin. And essentially, it closed the railroad down north of Coggin. So the railroad was only running between Anamosa and Coggin. One of the things that happened is that there was a bridge over Cedar Creek, just a little bit west of Prairieburg. And what I'm about to tell you was related to me by my neighbor, who was elderly, whose grandfather was actually an engineer on the Can. They had a bridge over Cedar Creek that was about 30 feet over the water, and the crews just didn't care for the bridge. They, when they approached the bridge, they would stop the train. Being a passenger train, everybody would detrain. The fireman would walk across the bridge. The engineer would give it a little bit of throttle, release the brakes, and the entire train would creep over the shaky bridge. When the locomotive reached the opposite side of the creek, the fireman would jump on board, bring the train to a stop. The passengers would walk across the creek bridge, get on the train, and resume their trip. This was all related to me by my neighbor, whose grandfather actually saw this happen. When Lewis Myers heard this, he says, "That's it. I'm shutting the railroad down." And as a consequence, he ended up taking the railroad to court for bankruptcy, and they granted him closure of the railroad. And actually on, I believe, November 20th, the railroad closed down of 1915, never, ever to be operated again. And that is one of the reasons that it was put up for auction. And when it was put up for auction, the requirement was that if you buy it, you operate the railroad. They had 4 auctions to where that requirement was in place. Nobody stepped forward to give a bid. Finally, after all these months, bankruptcy court removed the requirement to operate the railroad. As a result, when they had the next sale, there was a junk dealer from Kansas City, Kansas, Mr. Sonkin, who submitted a bid of $57,000 for the railroad. Plus, he had about $20,000 of back taxes that he had to take care of and a few other railroad obligations. But he essentially bought the railroad for $57,000. Cedar Valley Road still
Are
holds.
you on a Zoom?
Hello? Cedar Valley Road hope to still get the railroad. They made a proposal to the people that lived along the line of taxes from 50 cents to $3. And the people that lived along the can did not accept that, so there was never a vote. I thought this was an interesting photo. An automobile carrier for the Cedar Valley line that Waterloo, Cedar Falls, and Northern. Here's the line of the WCF&N. You can see from Cedar Rapids clear to Waverly. Now I wanted to show you is this is the rail as it arrived in Pulaski. And you'll see the river with a future bridge. This is actually the right-of-way that was completed, the dotted line. What Mr. Cass wanted to do was to use this portion to get his rail into Quasqueton and then to build new right-of-way from here to Brandon to connect with his railroad. Total distance about 15 miles. Would have been slick. He could have gotten it taken care of. As I said, the vote for the tax of 50 cents to $3 for the landowners on both sides, that was rejected by the people that live along the can. It was accepted by the people that would have lived along the new right-of-way. But since there wasn't 100%, the tax vote never took place. Had to include a picture of the gentleman that bought the railroad. This is Mr. Sonkin of Sonkin Galamba company in Kansas City, Kansas. A lot of people think he was a villain, but he's actually kind of a savior. Here's their company in Kansas. A little bit of everything. I couldn't believe it. I actually found this sign that somebody had of the corporation. It no longer exists today. Some of you may recognize this is a an older railroad man's magazine that was very popular early in the 1900s. Had a lot of stories in it. Mr. Sonkin, after he bought the railroad and knew that the can was, or the WCF&N was not going to buy it, he started looking elsewhere. And he came across this communication that the UK was soliciting Canada for any surplus rails, for surplus rail equipment, anything that had to do with railroad that could be used in World War I effort. At this time, the United States was not in World War I, but they were supplying a lot of the equipment. When Sonkin found out about this, he made an offer to the Allies to sell the can, what was left of it, which was the locomotive, a locomotive, 3 cars, bridges, steel bridges, by the way, all the rail, and all the ties. Never said what he made off of it, but I've seen articles that said upwards to $500,000 at that time, and that was a lot of money. So what he eventually did is that they used the term boxed it up and shipped it overseas. And as near as we can tell from the research, it actually ended up in France. Here's the locomotive. Here's a 10-wheeler. This is the last operating locomotive on the can. Matter of fact, this locomotive was used to rip up the rail. And this was the one that was actually sent to France. I was really hoping to find the logo on the side of the locomotive, but I could not have that come out. Here's some of the things that Sonkin had, that a lot of it went into the war effort. Now I want to draw your attention to what's left of the can. This is actually where a bridge was in a park in Lynn County, Iowa, called the Buffalo Creek Park. And I just happened to find this kind of by accident after the book was published. And the park system actually has almost a half a mile of pristine right-of-way. Couldn't believe it. This is the right-of-way. My friend, Mr. Price here, took me out to look at it, but this is the right-of-way that runs for almost a half a mile of the can. And I have talked to the conservation people, and they are, now that they know what is really going on, they are going to sign it to let people that are in the park know what it is. Here's an abutment that was poured in 1911. And I'll tell you, it's as pristine today as it was back then. And as you can see, this was pretty much the construction of all bridges between Coggin and Kwoski. This is my friend Deb Crawford's property. Lives right outside of Kwoski, and they actually mow what is left of the can right away on their property. After I wrote the book, a gentleman gave me this pass. to a Mr. W.F. Cody. Does anybody happen to know who that might be? Yeah. I have looked all over hoping that he had a show in the area during 1905. I have not been able to find anything. And on the back, in order to make this valid, it has to be signed. It was never signed. And there it is. Whoops. Getting a little tough there. This is a door off of a can box car that ended up in a farmer building close to where Deb Crawford lives. They were able to salvage the door. This is in the Kewaskum Area Historical Society's wall, and all the hardware and everything else is there. So one thing I forgot to mention is that their museum has the most extensive collection of anything to do with the can. If anybody would like to see more of the railroad itself. You've seen this before. This is the engine house. But I wanted to show you something. This is a rendering by Stuart Buck. And I absolutely love it. He brought the scene to life. Like I said, we really had a lot of issues trying to find photos of the early railroad. But this is as close as it comes to having a railroad brought to life. And Stuart, you here? This is also Stuart's. This ended up being the front and the back cover of the book, and depicts, I think, very well the kind of the essence of the can, because the can had many, many bridges, many bridges. You've seen this before as well. This is the freight house in Anamosa, 1960 photo. Here's a recent photo. This is at the ghost town of Edinburgh, which is operated by the Jones County Historical Society. And they actually paid to have it moved from Anamosa to the middle of Jones County, which is where Edinburgh is located. But it's just great. Ex-Milwaukee, ex-can, and it's been used for a lot of different things. Jim, you want to say anything?
Pancake breakfast first of May, first Sunday in May. It now has a steel roof on it too. So it'll be there for a long time.
Yep, you guys do a good job of taking care of it. One of the things that I think, Jim, you brought this up to me. For anybody that knows anything about hobos, this is a moniker that is left all over the United States. It's by a gentleman that was a hobo, and his nickname was Tex, King of the Tramps. And this is on the back side of the ex-Anamosa and Can Depot. Wasn't there somebody around that's cataloging these, Jim?
It actually came from Oregon, I think. Father and son were going around researching hobos, tramps.
Since we have so many rail experts in here, this hoop here fascinated me. I've never seen it on any other depots. Anybody know what that might be for?
Be a grab iron?
What was that?
Would that be a grab iron to get you up into the depot?
I don't know. Jim, did you ever come up with anything? Here's a rare ticket along the full route of the can, Anamosa to Pulaski. And you can see yet even another logo up here that was used on the railroad. Here's the back side of that ticket. As you can see, that's close to the very end of operations. Here's another excursion ticket. These, by the way, are all in the Quasqueton Area Historical Society. I was telling you earlier about the different logos that were used on paperwork. Here's the black and white. Here's the color. Here's something that I found on eBay quite some time ago. Now, of course, that's not their passenger train. That's just a lithograph. But if you look along the side over here, it says Chicago, Anamosa, and Northern. And you can see the high security hole in the box to put a padlock on. I also have a Chicago, Anamosa, and Northern lantern. I only know of one other one in existence. Here's the book. And what I'd like to do is I've got a little demonstration that I want to show you. I want to get back to the flight. For those of you that have or buy the book, there's a CD at the back of the book that actually has what we call a flight over the right of way of the can from one end of the, all you got to do is put it in your machine, turn it on, and away it goes. But I want to show you a couple of things here. And the gentleman that put this all together is Carol. Stand up. Wait till you see this. This is absolutely amazing of the time that he took to put this thing together. And the whole video runs about 19 minutes, but I'm just going to show you a little bit. Here's the flight data, 120 mile an hour. Okay, this is what we call the flight. And it's showing, the icon is showing how the can got out of Anamosa. The yellow is a CNW, the orange is the Milwaukee, and the red is the can. And Carol did all the research on this to locate the rail. And for anybody that lives along this line, you can actually see the details of your buildings and the surrounding area. And it's a unique perspective that you don't normally see. But this was all put together on Google Earth Pro. And I thought it was a great enhancement to the book itself. And it's just a great way to, especially if you're out trying to figure out where the right of way is. And like I say, this runs for about 19 minutes from Anamosa to Kwoski, and it's part of the book. And also there's another feature of the book that is on the same CD that has GPS coordinates on it. As I was writing the book, I thought, geez, maybe the reader would like to know or like to see the area I was talking about. So what I did is I put together a list as we go through the book in order. And if you're a Google Earth geek, you can copy and paste the coordinates into the Google Earth search engine, and it will fly you right to where I'm talking about in the book. As far as I know, that's pretty unique. So there's two features that are all inclusive with the book itself. That's all I had. Thanks for listening. Yes.
Did I hear you earlier state that you're researching and starting a new book possibly?
I'm trying to stay close to home, and I'm doing research typically on the Milwaukee Road in eastern Iowa, and a lot of it's in Jones County where I live. Yep. But hopefully I can talk Carol into providing one of those for me. Yes.
Was the original plan for this railroad to go to Chicago?
You know, that's a funny thing with a name like Chicago. We never found anything, but we did find that they had plans to go to Davenport. So not Chicago. And how they got the Chicago name in the title, I have no clue.